Hey, welcome everyone to I So Appreciate You, an honest, raw, and sometimes funny podcast about work, community, life, and all the other stuff we juggle. Hi, I'm Pahoua.
And I'm Nadege, and we're colleagues at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. In addition to that, we're friends. And so when we talk, our conversations can run the gamut. We can start talking about board meetings and governance procedures. We can get into mother-daughter dynamics, and then we can be like, where are we going to dinner tonight?
I prefer that conversation. And so we thought that maybe some of you would like to join us in conversation. So here we are with I So Appreciate You. Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to dive into what happens when an organization transitions from a white leader to leaders of color. Our guest, Duchesne Drew, president of NPR, will share his thoughts with us. But before that,
we have to talk about Beyonce.
Let's talk about her.
Because why wouldn't you start every conversation talking about Beyonce?
This is why you're my co-host.
Well, earlier this year, maybe it's not that long ago, my sense of time means nothing these days, or actually, we're in 2022 now. Last year, Beyonce made fashion history by being the first Black woman to wear that iconic Tiffany diamond, some like obscene number of carats.
128. I mean, after 50 carats,
honestly, after 2 or 3, I don't know what I'm doing. And and I saw that, and I saw like everybody was talking about it. And I just thought, why is this such a big deal? Like, why is it a big deal that Beyonce, who is like, I mean, come on, she's Beyonce.
She's Beyonce.
Is wearing a Tiffany diamond. And it kind of hit me like, here we are still highlighting the first and only to do something. And the reason that stuck with me is because of our topic today. It's about leadership and the weight that comes with kind of being the first and the only. And we're going to chat a little bit about that. Your experience specifically, Pahoua.
Yeah, I mean, in that Beyonce article, that Beyonce instance, it was a, benign example, but it also brought a lot of emotions, though. Should she, shouldn't she? Anyway.
What did her pictures look like?
That's
blah,
right.
blah, blah. Yeah, too much.
Well, I forwarded you an article that popped in my Twitter feed a while back, and the title of the report is Making or Taking Space. Initial themes on nonprofit transitions from white to BIPOC leaders. This is specific to nonprofits, but I think that it will read and feel true to a lot of people no matter what industry you're in. This is a report that was written by the Building Movement Project on behalf of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. And it's a long report, but what I gathered from it, from the themes that they lifted up, was that there is an expectation placed on leaders of color who step into the roles left by white leaders.
There's absolutely an expectation.
And maybe any time, but especially this time that we're living in.
Well, you've had that experience.
I've had that experience. And I think that is what the things I felt when I stepped into the executive director role after my amazing boss, who's probably listening, Sean Kershaw, left the Citizens League. So this is a very long-standing organization in Minnesota. It started in 1952, and it was always led by white men. And each white man led it with a very long tenure. So it being almost 70 years old and only having, 7 executive directors by the time I said yes to the role, I remember being excited to take it on. But as soon as I did, this feeling settled in for me of I was the first, and that was the headline. Like every press release was first woman of color, first person of color to take this role.
Okay, so, when that happens, regardless of, obviously you're qualified. Like, I know you're talented.
I've been there. Obviously. I told Sean what to do, right. So I figured I could do it.
But does it make you doubt yourself a little bit in that, like, is this the only reason I'm here?
Well, I think had I not had spent time there and felt comfortable already doing the work, I would have. Because there is a movement to place leaders of color in roles. And we are not always successful in those roles because we have not been trained or groomed. There's not been an intentional pathway for us. And the environment has not been created for us to be well received.
So when you found, here you are in this role, what were some of the biggest challenges, whether they were real or perceived by you as you are stepping into this role that has previously been held by white men?
So here's the kicker. It wasn't the work. Policy, comfortable. Going to a hearing room at the Capitol, comfortable. It was the other stuff. like it was nearing year end. Will my predominantly white wealthy donors support this organization now that I was leading it?
Okay, I'm going to call you on that. Why is that not the work? I mean, isn't that the work?
I mean, that is the work. Okay, so to be fair, every executive director has to fundraise. So that is a large part of the work. When I think about the work, I think about the mission that the Citizens League is charged with is to involve people in good governance, government, and policy making. And that's, to me, was the work. Of course, fundraising is the work, but it was how will people react to me is the piece I'm talking about.
No, and I hear you, but I want to push you and I want to name that work that you're doing, that emotional labor, the figuring out how to
I see what you mean. Yes, of course, that is the work.
That's the work.
We don't value that work, though.
No, we don't.
So then I don't value that work.
I want to value it for you, so I'm not going to let you slide past it. That's part of the work.
Thank you. That's where you're going with that. Yes, this is also the work that all of us, all leaders of color, we have this emotional burden, right? This emotional work that we're doing that does not get recognized. This is not on my performance evaluation.
Nope.
I don't get a raise based on how well I do here, but I've got to do it, right?
Correct.
And I do it. I can't bring attention to it. I've just got to do it. I will commiserate with folks like you, right? With girlfriends, other leaders of color, like, oh my gosh. And sometimes we're so tired we don't even talk about it. We just like nod knowingly because there's a lot to, especially, again, what this article points out is other leaders who are not leaders of color are probably not going to feel the way that we do stepping in, following, let's say, a charismatic white leader because they don't have to. They don't have that emotional baggage of, why am I here? Am I the right person? I'm the first woman, first person of color. If I fail, if this organization of 70 years dies on my watch, it will be remembered. Like that is what I carried every day into work. On top of like just doing the capital W work. But you're right. And this is why you hear about burnout. Mm-hmm. This is why when I hear, and I'm not one for rumor mills if you know me, but if I hear someone talk about a leader of color saying, oh, why don't they? I'm like, what have you done to support them? Because we can't lose another person. And I know how difficult, it is to step in any role, but to step into a leadership role where there's just seemingly more demands on you.
Right. And they come from all sides, right? They come from the fact of your role. They come from external constituents. They come from
your staff.
Questions are being asked that sat dormant for years, but all of a sudden, because you're here, there's like a ticking time clock. Like, oh, we've now got a leader of color in place, and therefore we should solve this equity problem that has been like with the organization its entire duration.
That's right. It's your job to solve for it now because we hired you. Isn't that great? And you're here now, so you're going to solve for it. Whereas I think our white counterparts may be involved in the same conversations, but, and this is my interpretation, it might be a thought exercise for them. I feel a real sense of urgency.
Right. Well,
and
you
a
feel
deep sense of responsibility to at least make progress. No one's going to solve for racism.
No, because if we could, we would have done it.
Yeah, we would have done that already.
I'll do it right now. I'll snap my fingers.
But what is the tangible difference that you're going to make while you're here?
Yep.
Like, I feel that. And I've always felt that at every job, especially when race comes up, when equity comes up. What are you going to do? Because you look the part, what are you going to do to earn your spot here?
These are the really deep questions and conversations that I think, you and I have variations on this theme all the time. But I think as we see organizations being really intentional about their leadership choices that they're making, both locally and nationally, right. I think that, this article that you've shared and that certainly will make available is really something people should stop and think about, which is why I'm super excited for the rest of this conversation with Duchesne Drew, because he has experienced this, I think, throughout his career.
Yes, and most recently stepping in as the president of NPR.
Yeah, so I think we've got a really great conversation ahead of us, and we'll be right back after the break. At the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, we partner with hundreds of nonprofits to support their endowment funds. An endowment is a great way to provide your organization with stable income for generations to come. If you are interested in learning more about starting an endowment, contact a member of our team by visiting spmcf.org/endowment.
Welcome back. We are delighted to welcome Duchesne Drew to our show today. Before we get started, Duchesne, we have 3 quick questions. It's a tradition here to get us warmed up. You ready?
Let's do it.
All right. Red or white wine?
Red.
Solo trip or group tour?
Group tour.
Sweet tooth or salty snacks?
Salty snacks.
I would have totally pegged you for a solo trip
Really?
kind of guy.
I feel like you've got the like group biking and the other things that you do. See, that didn't surprise me
Well, it's
at all.
because he does all of those that he just needs to get away. Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, I'm going to believe you.
All right. Before we dive in, we want to give our listeners just kind of a quick snapshot of your bio. You're a veteran newspaper reporter, editor, and manager, and now president of Minnesota Public Radio. Previously, the community network VP at the Bush Foundation. And congratulations on recently being named a new trustee to the Columbia University Board.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats on that.
So, earlier in our show, Pahoua and I were chatting about leadership. We do that a lot, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's important. It's a big topic. But more specifically, we were chatting about this article that Pahoua sent me some weeks ago about, BIPOC leaders making or taking space, basically in that transition from white leadership. And I know you've had a chance to dig into that article a little bit, and we're gonna really chew on it. But just curious, any initial reactions after reading it?
I thought it was really thoughtful. I could relate personally to elements of it, and then there are other pieces that weren't my experience, but they still seemed familiar to me, just living in this world. And I think it really spoke to how much more intentional we need to be as we not just hire people into leadership roles, but how we really position them to succeed and position the organizations to make the most of what they have to offer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, we can see in our community, all you have to do is look around. There have been a lot of leadership transitions as of late and some really great new BIPOC leaders stepping to the helm of organizations. And so it is clear that there's an intentionality around that. But is it enough just to hire someone into the job? Or is there a little bit more that we need to be doing?
Yeah, hiring is critical, right? But it's not sufficient. And I think about how with most hires, black, white, or green, right? Like the real work begins once they're there, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of organizations should be more intentional about the whole arc of someone getting off on the right foot, but also having support and opportunities to stop and sort of pause and talk about how it's really going and what would make it better and what are the things that maybe were a little surprising or different than what either had been discussed or had been hoped for.
And what I appreciate about this report is that it's specific to the nonprofit sector. Mm-hmm. So the report, again, the title of the report is Making or Taking Space, Initial Themes on Nonprofit Transitions from White to BIPOC Leaders. And this is work being done by the Building Movement Project on behalf of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. And I think that in the last couple of months, we've been hearing a lot about the Great Resignation, which is creating space for people to come in. And I think just the growing diversity of not just Minnesota, but the country is, I think, providing an opportunity for organizations to think about hiring leaders of color. But to Nadege's point, I think hiring is we're not done after that, right?
Far from being done.
And there's a lot to be done to create an environment where everyone feels a sense of belonging. But certainly those leaders of color who are stepping into maybe predominantly white spaces, especially following a white leader who might be well-liked, charismatic, or not, right? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, Duchesne, that there were some pieces in the report that resonated with you and some that were familiar but not your experience. Can you touch on what some of those were for you?
Sure. So, I stepped into my role at NPR last May of 2020. So
you and I started at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. We were on the same schedule. So about 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered. And so, I came into the role knowing that there would be some challenges and knowing that there'd be a ton of upside once I got my arms around all the things. But it was more challenging financially because of the pandemic, to be frank. Right. So we had this as one of the issues raised in this think piece, which is that sometimes you come in and it wasn't that anyone lied to me. Things changed, right?
Yeah.
And we still had to react to it, right? Like we were having the best year ever until we weren't. I bring that up just because I think just this sense of like, you think it's going to be one deal and you get in and it's another deal. And that's before we even begin to talk about George Floyd's murder leading to racial reckoning all over the globe and leading to a lot of organizations having to screw up with their own shortcomings when it comes to equity issues. We had our issues and still have issues around that at NPR and American Public Media Group. None of those were secrets. I mean, that was part of the interview process. So it wasn't like no one knew or was thinking about how we could do better on that front. But it was almost like the fuse was lit and we were like running out of time, right? You have to say, no, we're going to come in and do X and Y and Z. And it's like, no, you're doing it now.
Right. Yeah.
You know? And so I definitely felt like a lot of the issues raised in this piece were present for me as I was starting. A lot of the internal cultural and culture sort of stressors that were there. They were always there on some level. They're in many organizations. Just became a lot more acute with all the stress people were carrying, living through a pandemic. In many instances for our organization, people on the streets covering the racial unrest issues and then living it as well.
Right.
This is our home. And so there was just a lot more tension and stress. And so there was no honeymoon. You know, you think oftentimes when you start in a role, like you have the first few months, you just sort of like
to meet and greet.
Let's do lunch, right?
Enjoy inbox. There's just 3 emails in there.
There was none of that. Like my first day, once again, you know, like this is the nature of the times. Like my first day, I was handed the list of people taking buyouts and handed financial targets for additional layoffs to make the budget work. And that wasn't because people were trying to be callous. It's like, if we get that wrong, then we cease to exist. If we get that wrong, then we're laying off a lot more people than if we make strategic cuts, right? But that was literally day one. Right. Here's a list of people you're not going to get to work with for very long. Yeah. And then here's a number, right, or numbers that become names of real people.
Right.
In time, right? And in a short time. I had to have that figured out within the first couple of weeks.
Wow.
Do you have any sense, you know, certainly the pandemic, the racial reckoning would have made any leader stepping into your role, would have challenged any leader. But did you ever get the sense that you were being pushed a little bit faster because you were now a Black man in the space at a time of racial reckoning, at a time when an organization, as you commented, you know there are things to work on? Did you ever feel, would I be pushed quite this fast if I weren't me?
I don't know if I felt as if I was being pushed or if I was being pulled by events. And I get the nature of the question. I think I probably came in, to be frank, more equipped to deal with many of these issues than most of my peers or my boss, just because I had experience dealing with these issues, not just because I'm a Black man, but because of the nature of the leadership roles I played both in the workplace and in community over time. And that was part of what made me an attractive candidate for the role. Sure. So I think it's worth saying again, like they were aware that we had some cultural issues, that we have not been as successful in holding on to and elevating women and people of color over time. Certainly not the only reason I was hired, but it was part of the discussion as I went through the process. And so I think what happened was this sense of, okay, we're gonna step into these issues thoughtfully and tackle them over the coming months. Became, no, we're dealing with this right now. Like now.
The coming hours.
Yeah.
8 a.m., 10 a.m.
happening. I can smell the smoke, right? It's like literally like there is no like warm up, ramp up. It's like, let's begin as best we can, accelerating and leaning into this in a more meaningful way than I think otherwise would have been the case.
You talked about, the culture and internal dynamics, and then also talked about previously how, you saw yourself as more equipped or well equipped for the role at hand, given where the organization was and given all of your background experience, not just your personal lived experience. And I wonder, when you think about other leadership roles like that, do you think that as a sector or as organizations, we value that experience around, there's a lot of emotional labor in that experience around culture and internal dynamics, right? There's no ROI for that, right? But there's a lot of heavy, heavy work. Do you think we place enough value on that skill?
I don't think many places do, and I think it bites them. I think a lot of the places that have unhealthy cultures have unhealthy cultures because they haven't made it a priority.
I want to circle us back to something you said kind of at the top of our conversation about hiring's not just enough. You have to be intentional about the arc. And I'd just love to get your thoughts on what does that intentionality look like? I mean, have you had some really great experiences? Have you heard of some things that would be really good in shaping that arc?
And what have you put into place already?
I've got examples both in terms of my own experience, what I've seen. So I think back, I'll start with when I started at the Bush Foundation back in March of 2015. Jen Ford-Naridi, who's the president there, was my boss. And she spent 4 hours on each of the first 2 days I was there. And she had just a map. Here's the things you need to know. And it wasn't all stuff I had to do. I didn't have to memorize. It was just, here's how we got to now. Here's where we're going. Here's how you fit in. Here's kind of a sense of where we are as an organization, because it was a huge, at that point still, sort of ship turning in terms of change management was underway. I was coming in, if it was a baseball game, probably in like the third or fourth inning or something. I wasn't there at the beginning, but we hadn't got something stretched yet. And so I just appreciated that, because I think she was anticipating, that my head would be spinning for a bunch of reasons, but even just in understanding what journey we were on as an organization, right? I'm on a board where we were hiring a co-executive director to partner with the founding ED. So we were really intentional on the front end of thinking about what's person A's role, what's person B's role, what dimensions is they're going to share, how are we going to make sure that they are developing healthy, respectful, trusting relationships. How are we going to make sure the staff that reports to them feels like they're getting, we kind of mapped it all out, and we talked about it over and over again. We hired a consultant to work with the two of them to make sure there was kind of somebody who was available and thoughtful and skilled in this arena, who could help them sort of surface, discuss, resolve any differences that might pop up. I'm thinking about even, in my role here at NPR, John McTaggart, who's my initial boss, the CEO of APMG, assigned one of the SVPs, Mike Resler, to kind of be my body person. Like if you have any questions about anything large or small,
I never got a body person.
Right? Call Mike anytime, day or night.
We got to build that into our onboarding. I guess.
Call it a body person.
He was my guy. I could text him in the middle of a meeting going, what was that? What just happened here, right? Or and he was really clear. He was like, nothing's out of bounds. Nothing's silly. Nothing's, it's like, if I don't know, I'll tell you, right? But I recognize there's a lot spinning, and he'd been in that role a long time, at the company a long time, in various roles, actually. And so I think it's having somebody beyond the boss in that regard, who's available to help, right? And somebody who is really at that point just invested in you kind of getting off to a solid start, right? And who can be real with you about stuff, including saying, I don't know, but here's the questions I might ask.
Yeah. Well, this is somewhat connected to the creating the environment, I think. One thing I didn't expect, but I was really appreciative of when I entered the foundation. Obviously, people who know me, I'm a Hmong woman. And we have a lot of Hmong staff at the foundation. There was a group of us that got together, and we still communicate as a group now. And that sense of, we have someone new, we're going to wrap ourselves around this new person. We're also, especially during last year with anti-Asian hate, it was good to have that support. Curious whether staff at NPR, with your arrival, was there he just gets me. I won't have to explain these things because he and I might have the same lived experience, or at least we'll get some of the things that maybe they were going through or have been through. Any of that for you?
Oh, my wife, certain. Yeah. My wife was like, I think he gets me.
I would hope so.
Yeah. It was welcoming, but it was once again, it was kind of this somewhat distant, and there actually aren't that many Black folks at NPR. So you think about, we've got the current classical in the newsroom,
which is why it's even more important.
Yeah. Oh, for certain. Yeah. So it's not that people weren't warm. It was just they're just scattered. They're siloed.
Yes.
Right. They are very siloed, and so it wasn't like there was as much of a sense of community there as I've experienced in some other places. We're working on that. There's a BIPOC ERG that I think has really...
that's Employee Resource Group,
yes,
listeners.
That's Employee Resource Group. So all the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the org are invited to participate in kind of a monthly get-together. And we've done, in addition to the Zoom meetings, right, we've also actually done stuff in person, which has been wonderful.
Oh, that's nice.
So I think that's one of the positive things in terms of really trying to just, we're not going to talk about work. Like, who are you? What makes you tick?
Right.
We actually, every meeting, their monthly meetings, every meeting, somebody, oftentimes two people will go and kind of tell their life stories. And sometimes they'll even do PowerPoints. Like, here's a picture of me when I was 5 on a pony or whatever. But it's just, we're getting to know each other as people.
I kind of love that, actually, a little bit.
It's been nice. It's been really nice. Because then, you're like logging in for the next month and you know something about this person beyond like what they do, right? And where they sit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've done that in our staff meeting.
Yeah, we've done, but I'd love to see pictures of, 5-year-old versions.
We've done some pictures, but this is also how I found out that one of my team members had auditioned for, what's the singing show? Why am I blanking right now?
American Idol?
Yes.
Ooh, nice.
Oh, wow.
She had gone to Chicago. So anyway.
We have a lot of talented staff.
We do.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised when you start asking around. Well, maybe not this role, maybe other roles, because the reality is, this article really focused on leadership, like that top role. But frankly, this happens kind of at all leadership levels. Have you ever found, or as I try to unwind this question as it's rolling itself in my brain, are there just the things that like you should just not do? Don't ever do that again. Like have you encountered some things that if you could put together a list proactively and say to folks, don't do this.
When you're bringing people on?
When you're bringing a new, BIPOC leader in a role that probably is historically been held by a white person.
That is such a good question. Dying to know.
See, I'm so glad I got to a good question.
I think they're all great questions. I think on a high level, just be really clear on the front end that it's going to look and feel and be different. That's why you hired that person. Like, the truth of the matter is, if nothing meaningful changes at all, they're probably not being themselves, or you probably hired somebody who's different than what you thought you were going to get, right? I mean, it's not just a paint job we're talking about. You're trying to bring in people who have different perspectives and have different experiences and have different ways of moving in the world, and to have that shape all the things, right? And to create really not just for people of color within and beyond an organization, but just to be an example of, like, there are lots of ways to lead. There are lots of ways, right, to build and to create the work that you're charged with creating and building together, whatever that may be, right? It doesn't have to look one way. And so I think the thing that's most important is to encourage leaders to be their authentic selves. And as you encourage that, to be prepared for that to make you uncomfortable at times. If you're a board member or if you're another staff member, like, this is what you actually asked for. Here it is.
And I think that's key.
Yeah.
Because there are some people I work with now who say, I keep hearing that, but are you ready for it?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's not enough to open the spot. You actually have to make that space. And I really love you saying that if nothing meaningful changes, they probably aren't being themselves.
Right.
Because that's probably the reality. They're probably following the script that you've written for them. And if that's the case, you didn't need me. You didn't need you. Didn't need Pahoua. You could have put anyone in there.
And we're probably dying. Right? Like, that's the other thing, too.
A little bit inside every day.
If we're showing up and we're reading somebody else's lines, right?
Right.
That's probably killing us a little bit every day, right? And so I will tell you that I was very clear from the moment I applied for this job that I was not going to be that person. Once again, not elbows out, but really clear in my own mind about what kind of person I am and so should be in all the spaces I inhabit, right? Mm-hmm. And how that shapes the leadership walk that I'm on, right? And so I try to be reflective and try to take feedback and try to make sure that things I'm doing and saying are landing effectively. So I'm not trying to be like, of course I'm perfect, right? But I'm also generally unapologetic about how I roll. And I think particularly if you're clear up front about what you're trying to accomplish and inviting feedback and inviting ongoing dialogue, it gives you more leeway to just be yourself. I know I'm very different than people who led in the organization previously, and it's not just because of the melanin count, right? But I think people, whether they like what I'm doing, all of what I'm doing or not, I think they know it's coming from a place of sincerity, and that it's coming from a place of really wanting to drive us to a different level of excellence, right? And to create a more inclusive and more equitable and more successful organization. If we were better, this is true of all of our organizations. If we were really, really good, excellent at bringing in a wide range of people, and not only having them kind of be their best selves, but but be their best selves together to create things that they couldn't create absent the other person bringing their A game,
right.
That would be amazing. Most of us don't get to see that or work in that space or breathe that kind of air, right? And so that's what I'm driving toward every day, and that's what I'm excited about, and that's why I don't mind disrupting things along the way, because what we're doing now actually isn't working for lots of people.
That's right.
Right.
It reminds me of a piece of advice that I heard or an observation. We hire for difference, but we onboard for sameness. Mm-hmm. So we end up back where we started. And then those of us who are trying to show up authentically, we do die a little bit every day. Well, then why don't you just tell me what you want, right? And we could be working so much harder, more creatively for the organization if we're given that space. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this is as good a place as any to stop, because we could spend the next few hours sort of chewing on this. We'd have to get that red wine, though, to make it worth our while.
And the salty snacks.
And the salty snacks.
Don't forget the snacks.
But before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance, for a last word, if there's any sort of parting thought or comment that this conversation has elicited for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I just think that, and I touched on it earlier, I think leadership comes in different forms, right? Good leadership comes in different forms. There are some consistencies along the way. Communication, for example, listening, right? But I think that we have to be more comfortable with and more committed to investing in and supporting different kinds of leadership. Being excited about what that can bring us. And we should think about what are we missing out on right now?
Yeah. Because
it's such a narrow bandwidth. One of the things that, when I got this job, what I recognized, I knew it from the time I applied, but it really hit me once I got it. When I was hearing from friends and strangers, it was like, there aren't that many roles in this community where people of color are driving, where what we're driving is something that white folks are heavily invested in.
Yes.
Right?
Wow.
So that's not meant to denigrate the people of color running organizations that are serving people of color. That's not at all where I'm going. But so often that stuff, I think, can seem peripheral to our white friends and neighbors because it's not their deal. NPR is Minnesota, right? It's at the heart. It's Lake Wobegon and more, right? But it is Lake Wobegon, right?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so I just remember a lot of people were just really happy about it, but just oh, wow, they did that.
Well,
because it doesn't happen often enough.
That's why we thought of you when we thought about this article and thought you are driving this.
Yeah.
Very white Minnesota institution.
Yeah, and I love it. I've been an NPR member since 6 months after I moved here. That shouldn't be such a big deal in 2020, 2021 now, right? It should just be able, of course, there's talent from all parts of our community. And we're here in big numbers. We are 30% people of color, 30% of the metro area now, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And but our leadership cadre doesn't look anything like that. Nothing like that. So I think that we've got more organizations need to decide that they're going to not take some big R risk, capital R risk. I was not a risky hire.
Yeah.
Just to say that. I was not a risky hire, right? And I think the guy who hired me would say that. This was not a risky hire. We're really glad to have him, right? So, but I think we need to see that happen more and more and more in this market, in this community, and it'll be part of what I think helps us walk the talk and part of what will help us attract and keep more diverse talent in the market. I mean, it's still too much of a rarity for the day and time we're living in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Duchesne, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
What a great conversation.
Wow. This has been a really fantastic conversation. First, your experience, and then hearing Duchesne talk about his leadership and how he's really stepped into it. What, Pahoua, has stood out to you about today's chat?
Two things.
Okay.
How if we don't embrace the change that we hired for, that the people you just hired who are different are slowly dying every day. You're nodding your head.
I am nodding my head. I've got the Fugees killing me softly running into the background.
And then the other thing, which he put into words, a feeling I've had, and I didn't think about it the way that he did, which was he is leading a very Minnesota institution, NPR. Had he led, these weren't his words, but had he led an organization that was known to be serving majority people of color, people might went, oh yeah, that makes sense. But because he was now leading, a black man leading NPR, it was different. It felt different. People noticed. And I think that's a little bit of how I felt stepping into the role of being the executive director for the Citizens League. And I didn't think about it in the way that he just talked about it today. So he named it.
He named it. We've all heard it, and it's time for it to be not so special anymore.
Yes, we don't want to be that special.
Right. It's time for it to be regular, and it's time for change. Change is change, and I think that's what we learned today. So with that, everyone, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to I So Appreciate You. You can find us on Facebook at I So Appreciate You Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at So Appreciate You.
We'd also appreciate you taking a moment to leave us a review. And if you like our show, be sure to follow I So Appreciate You on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to us right now.
Have a question or a topic suggestion? Email us at podcast@spmcf.org. Thank you for listening to I So Appreciate You.